Hey everyone, welcome to a very special episode of 4GQ TV, and we have a very special guest today. Real quick, before we get to him, I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce that Paris is on the panel with me today, and our special guest is known as HC Anderson. And could you introduce yourself for our audience?
Yeah, my name's Hoche Anderson, sometimes called HC Anderson lately. Cartoonist, got into filmmaking recently. It's been around in the game for a little while now.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, the first question I gotta ask is, how did you get started in this business?
How did I get started? In terms of like how I got my first gig or
Uh,
I
I would say first gig and how you got first introduced into the business of art in general.
well, I started drawing when I was a little kid. I got interested in visual storytelling very early on. And I was one of those kids who always had a pencil in hand and a piece of paper. I was always drawing something pretty consistently throughout my life. And I've often said the field of art sort of, it found me more than I found it. I was always kind of doing it. So it's became sort of inevitable what I was going to wind up doing with the rest of my life. So I got interested in visual storytelling really early through Star Wars and through this Walt Disney cartoon called Man in Space,
Mm.
and they put kind of a love of science fiction into my head and of world building into my head and of visual storytelling into my head, either on the screen or on the page. And I just always was interested and always wanted to pursue it. So by the time I was 14, there was a comic book being published in Toronto, which is where I live, called Mr. X. It was published by a company called Vortex Comics.
Mm.
And I found out that they were in the city. I went and I checked them out. My work wasn't very good at that point, but they were kind enough to like invite me to come back, and that's sort of how I got my first professional involvement through the guys at Vortex Comics. And then it was just a process like everybody else did in the 80s, where you were constantly submitting stuff, getting rejected. Back then, it was like, it wasn't like social media time. This was through the mail. You had to like, put together photocopy submissions and throw them in the mail and hope to get some kind of response. And I did that for about maybe 4 years, or actually about 6 years before I finally started to get a few hits. And one thing leads to another, and here I am today. But it was a slow process. It was not like an overnight thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet the in the 80s, taking photocopies, put it all in in a big like envelope package, mail
Yep.
it off, and then you
Yep.
got
Yeah, keep your fingers crossed. Exactly. And more often than not, you wouldn't even get a response. If you did get a response, it was come back when you're ready. If you were lucky, a lot of times it wasn't even that nice. But yeah, it's kind of weird because I have a certain nostalgia for those old days. I kind of miss going down to the print shop and with my stack of new work and getting it, getting the photocopies back were the first taste of what it was like to see stuff in print. So it was a real kind of an exciting time to go to like, the proto Kinkos or whatever it was, the neighborhood quick stop, and get stuff printed up. It was cool. I kind of miss it.
toss your quarters into the machine
Yeah,
and
exactly. Or
send it
get the
around.
print card, whatever. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
So after Vortex Comics, did you have any big jobs after that, or did you go independent?
Yeah, let me think about that for a second. So I was working with Vortex. I wrote and drew this. I pitched them like a 5 issue series, like a sci-fi series. Excuse me. I wound up writing and drawing the first issue of that and some of the second issue of that. And then at some point, Vortex and I stopped seeing eye to eye on things. I think they were dissatisfied with my rate of the progress of my growth as an artist and as a writer. And I was becoming disillusioned with them for my own reasons. And at a certain point, there was a parting of the ways. So that kind of led me to like about, like I said, a number of years of just submitting stuff. And I submitted to everybody, all the indie publishers of the time. I didn't submit so much to Marvel and DC just because I was becoming less interested in superheroes at that point. But in terms of all the indie publishers of that day, I submitted to everybody. Pacific, Renegade, Kitchen Sink, you name it, I submitted to them. First Comics, everybody. And the only person that really got back to me with any interest was Fantagraphics. And this was after submitting to them 2 or 3 times. And I broke in through Fantagraphics through their Eros Comics imprint, which they had set up at that point in the very early 90s to try to stave off bankruptcy, basically, because they were about to go into the crapper, unfortunately. Their brand of boutique indie comics were just not selling. Even though the quality was there, the sales weren't there. And Howard Chaykin's Black Kiss had come out and had created a market of erotic comic books. And they ran with that, and they were able to keep themselves afloat through the Eros line for quite a number of years. So that's kind of how I broke in finally.
Nice. Yeah, I remember that sort of time period where it was sort of taboo, right, for those sort of comics, and you know, the sexier side of the industry, you know, more robust sort of drawing, and you know,
I mean, it existed.
All the parts, right?
It was there in the underground scene, and it was there in publications like, you know, Playboy and Penthouse. You get some more racy stuff,
Right.
and certainly in the undergrounds they were much more extreme. But in terms of going out into the, you know, the comic store indie crowd, they weren't really into that. There wasn't a market there for that, and definitely not in the mainstream. There was no way Marvel or DC. I remember when Chaykin was first putting out Black Kiss in his interviews, he talked about how he had tried to promote the idea of an erotic comic to the mainstream publishers for years, only for them to say, no, get out of here with that. So yeah, he was kind of a trailblazer.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. So on your career, as you're growing, you know, in the 80s, and you're getting these opportunities, is there anything sort of that stood out to you, that sort of stands out to you back then, that, you know, that you would change, that you would have changed, as far as like all the information that you know now? Or is it just, you know, it is what it is? You know, going back in time, sometimes you think about things, you're like, oh, I should have probably thought about that, and you probably had an idea of things, but, you know, how do you feel about that?
Well, you know, I mean, in a way, like, that's sort of a pointless exercise. I mean, it is what it is. It turned out the way it turned out, and honestly, I can't really complain, because dude, what did I tell you about the cat? What did I tell you? Come on in, puss. She is like clockwork, man. Kills me every time. Come on, kitty, hurry up. Sorry about that, fellas.
Oh, no worries.
Right.
No worries. We can fix that.
So I here's what I would change. But if I were to go back, if there was some magical time machine, I would just try. I would probably be a little bit more consistent, and I think I would probably focus a little bit more on the mainstream at the beginning of my career. So what I mean is, I've always been a very restless, creative type. I'm always wanting to experiment, and I think I took my passion for experimenting so fervently that I was very difficult to pin down. And I think when you're starting out, it's maybe a little bit better if people can sort of know who you are, what you are, where they can go to get your stuff, until you sort of build up that fan base. And I was always doing this and doing that and trying to so many different things. It was very difficult for me to kind of like find my particular groove. In a way that was good, just because I experimented so much that it kind of helped to build up my overall skill set. But I still wish I'd been a little bit more consistent in the beginning. And I also wish that I had tried to foster that mainstream career early on. I wish I'd started out at Marvel or DC, you know, gotten that kind of mainstream cred, developed those professional, in the trenches, month in, month out, get that comic book out there, skills and chops. And then develop a fan base there, and then maybe start to sort of like David Mazzucchelli, you know, starting out having this incredible run at Marvel, and then doing, you know, Born Again and Batman Year One, developing very serious mainstream cred, and then pushing that aside and doing stuff like Rubber Blanket, you know, and Marvel Fanfare, that crazy Angel story that he did in that style, anticipating Rubber Blanket. or City of Glass or Asterios Polyp or whatever the books that he's done over the years. I really kind of admire that. So I might have, if I were to do it over again, I might have made those adjustments. But again, what can you do? It is,
Yeah. You live and you learn, right? Growth
you live
is
and you
growth.
learn, brother. Absolutely.
Well, I would say that the 80s was really a hard time to kind of like break out, because there was a lot of traditional methods back then that, you know, comic companies didn't want to fall out of. It was very traditional and very
Absolutely.
similar to everything else. In the 90s, we start to see a breakout with like Todd McFarlane. We saw a breakout with Rob Liefeld. We saw breakouts with like Psylocke on the cover trying to look um, more fancy, I guess, more feminine. And then, you know, Vampirella was always the icon since like the 70s. She was one of the only ones that had her own kind of fan base and stuck out amongst everything else of the publishers. So you definitely went through one of the hardest periods of trying to break out in comics. And I think that's a testament to your success now and not giving up. I think that it kind of gave you that motivation not to give up.
100%, 100%. Although let me challenge one quick thing though, because the good part about when I was breaking in, absolutely, it was a much more, you know, it's a little bit more of a conservative time. But at the same time, it was still, this was in the era where the, you know, the kind of mainstream cred that comic books have now was starting to be birthed back then. And the diversity of the subject matter was really starting to become more of a thing in the 80s. I think of the 80s really as a time of incredible expansion and experimentation in comic books. So, I mean, I think both things are true, what we're saying. And I'm actually really glad that that's the time that I came about, because it was really, it was the time when we went from, you know, the stories have to be contained within a certain box to just breaking out of that box. Man, I got to witness that firsthand, and that was incredibly exciting. So yeah, so definitely happy to have emerged in that era for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Awesome.
A lot of first appearances happened in that era. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. No question.
So after all of that, how did you get into doing a comic book like biography of Martin Luther King Jr.?
That was a basically a commission from Fantagraphics Books. On one of our first conversations, they told me that they wanted to do some historical comics, and the publisher was really enamored of tackling King's story first. And being one of the few Black cartoonists at that time, I think I was probably a safe bet. I don't think my skills were there, but I think he at least had his ass covered politically. And the good thing, you know what I'm saying? And the good thing is, I was the right guy for that, because I had grown up in, like, you know, somewhat of a political household. Just like, you know, the news were discussed during the day, you know, every day. Current events were something that were of importance around the house, and also I just had a certain love of recent history, of world building. I'd fallen in love with Oliver Stone's filmmaking, Born on the 4th of July, Platoon. I love the fact that he was examining the 1960s through this really kind of bombastic cinematic lens. That's really appealed to me. JFK is one of my all-time favorite films. I saw that movie, I think, 5 or 6 times when it came out in 1990 or 91, whatever year it was. I think it was 1990. And so I was, my mindset was primed to do King. It wouldn't have been my choice. I didn't know that I was the right person to do that comic book, you know, 5 minutes before it got offered to me. But when it came up, it clicked. It made sense, and I was happy to jump on board. So yeah.
Yeah, that's an incredible feat right there. Because you're right. You're doing a comic book about, you know, one of the biggest people, and, you know, not just the African American community, but in the United States and almost the world, right?
In the world, man. He belongs to the world.
Yeah. So it's a definite. I probably would have been like, well, are you sure about this? But that's sort of where, when your skill sets, set in, you start really thinking about it. How did that, when you first found out you were going to do it, were you thinking it was going to just sort of, okay, I'll do it and it's not going to get, I'm sure you're hoping that it get a lot of fanfare, but was your mentality like, it is what it is sort of thing, based off of, what you guys were trying to do with it?
That's interesting. Well, I mean, let me backtrack for 1 second just to say that, I think I was lucky in that I was so young. I didn't realize the potential minefield that lay ahead of me.
Right.
So, when you're that young, man, you're just like, you're blind. You're happy to just wade into war without, I hate when people make comparisons to war, but you know what I'm saying? You're happy to wade into the conflict regardless, because you just don't know any better. So I benefited from that. But yeah, it was an assignment. I was excited to have it because it, like I said, it sort of clicked with me mentally. And I also realized, just the mercenary part of me realized that there would probably be a few eyeballs on it just because of the nature of the subject matter. But at no point did I expect it to. I didn't think I'd be talking about it, 30 years later or whatever the hell it's been, 20, whatever it's been, 30 years. So I didn't anticipate that at all. That's a shock. So I guess it turned out all right. There's a lot about it I would do differently today. I would do not one page the same today that exists. I would do the entire thing differently. But it seems like it landed okay with some people, so I shouldn't complain too much.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. It's awesome. I think a lot of people, the people that I've talked to, really liked it. And, I told them I was talking to you. They were like, oh my gosh, this dude is a creator right here. This Dr. King right there. So it's like, and it was something that's never, I don't know, was it ever done before? I
don't think so.
Right.
I'm not aware of that. This is something that's come up recently, and it's not something I ever really gave that much thought to over the years. Right. But it's been brought up to me so often lately that I've had to sort of reevaluate it. But the truth is, I don't really think there was this kind of book before then. If there were, there weren't any done at that level. Right. I've said this many times. I myself was influenced by the Martin Luther King story. This very slim pamphlet comic book from like the 1950s when King was doing his thing. I think it's called the Martin Luther King, the Montgomery story. I forget what it's called. I got a copy in my storage box, but it's a well-known comic book biography of Martin Luther King. As a matter of fact, it was an influence to John Lewis. John Lewis has talked about that comic book many times. I think that's one of the reasons he was inspired to write March, that 3-volume biography that he did, that he co-wrote about his own life. And I myself was inspired by that. So that there is that precedent, but in terms of doing like a full-on epic length biography of a political figure, of a cultural figure, I can't come up with one previous to this.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And I remember Dwayne McDuffie, I don't know why this came to mind, but I just remember when I first met Dwayne McDuffie, when I first started working with Milestone in the early 90s, Dwayne McDuffie took me aside and gave me a real writing critique about King. He's just like, too many words to the panel. You got to do this differently, that differently. And it's kind of cool because I've been rereading some Milestone comics recently. Up to this morning, I read some of Dwayne McDuffie's stuff on Blood Syndicate, and man, that guy could write. Him and Ivan Velez wrote some great stuff in Blood Syndicate. That guy could really write. So I had a great mentor in that guy early on in his career.
Oh, that is awesome.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of Carlo's next questions is as far as mentors, who are some of your favorite ones, or the ones that you sort of gravitated to?
Well, Dwayne McDuffie's definitely up there. Me and Dwayne didn't always get along so well personally, unfortunately. We kind of came more to an understanding later on in life. We were a little bit at loggerheads when we first met because we were both headstrong, and I was like a mouthy, cocky kid, and Dwayne was a seasoned vet, and I'm sure my youthful bravado probably rubbed his seasoned self a little bit the wrong way. but he also saw something in me in terms of having some talent. So he was willing to give me his time, which I'm grateful for. So Dwayne McDuffie was a big one. The people at Vortex Comics were early mentors of mine. I was going to do some work. This is like the publisher, Bill Marks, who I've given a hard time to over the years, but Bill was actually incredibly cool to me when I was starting out. So Bill, all due respect, brother. And Deborah Glenn Cross, he was his partner, and they were co-owners of Vortex, and they were both really instructive to me when I was starting out in terms of just sitting me down, giving me like just just like fundamental lessons in how to do the job at a professional level. That kind of stuff's invaluable. You can't get that from a book. You know what I mean? You need that somebody to sit in front of you and show you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. Dean Motter is another guy from back then. Lou Stathis, he was an editor at Heavy Metal and at High Times magazine, and then later on, he really made his name at Vertigo as one of, I think, the editor-in-chief or one of the big editors at Vertigo. I guess Karen Berger was the editor-in-chief, but Lou was up there. And Lou was another guy. I was doing some work for a company called Piranha Press in the early 90s. And Lou Stathis was writing, along with a guy named Robert Morales, a book called Skin Brace that I was going to do for Piranha Press. And they were sort of the Vertigo before Vertigo. All right. It's like early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And Lou was a real hard ass, man. And Lou really sat me down and showed me what for a lot of times and didn't hold back. He didn't like pull any punches at all. And it could be upsetting at the time. But Lou didn't give a shit because he knew he was right. And I knew he was right. So, it's people like that early in my life really helped to show me the way.
Yeah. That constructive feedback, it's real key, like whatever industry that you're working in, right? Because you want to know sort of like, okay, where am I at? What do I got to do to get to that next level? And I need that sort of that constructive criticism, right? So I know what to do to learn and grow. And that's good. People that sugarcoat it, you're not getting anything. You're just like, oh yeah, you're right. You're good to go. I'm like, no, really look at this and tell me what you really think, right? So,
I mean, I always admire. I never got to meet him, but Neil Adams. I'm a big Frank Miller fan. And Frank Miller talks a lot about how when he was starting out, he called up Neil Adams and got Neil Adams' daughter on the phone, and she's like, yeah, handed Frank Miller to her dad. Neil's like, come on down. Frank brought a bunch of his pages, and Neil tore those shits to shreds. Frank was like, thank you, sir. Let me have another. Came back whenever, a few weeks later with some new stuff. Neil tore him down again. I would have loved to have kind of had that experience with a hard ass like Neil Adams, for crying out loud. Right. One of the masters of the game of all time. You know what I mean? And to get that kind of feedback and then come back for more and improve to the point where finally Neil says to Frank, calls somebody up in one of the top companies and says, here, I got a kid, who's good. Give him some work. That's pretty impressive. Right. So, yeah, man, I guess I'm just saying I respect the mentoring process.
Awesome.
So lately, as of late, what has been any current projects you're working on or anything that you recently released?
Yeah, it's been a pretty productive, like 4 years or so. About 3 years ago, I published a book called Godhead, which is a science fiction comic book, which I'd had in my head for many years and had a hard time getting out into the world. And but I never gave up on it, and I finally got it out in 2018. And since then, it's been kind of one thing leading to the other. A lot of doors that were previously closed to me have started to open up a little bit, which is kind of nice. So yeah, it's been it's been a lot that I've done over the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years. I started working with a company called Neotext and published couple of really cool novellas, one called Stone, the other one called Rizzo, which were pretty close to getting optioned, which I'm pretty excited about. That was a lot of fun to write. It's sort of cautionary tale about a United States in which essentially Trump 2.0 is like been allowed to, that power base has been allowed to fester, and fascism has taken over in America, and our character Stone is basically standing up to the system after the system has tried to ground her into the dirt. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm pretty excited about Stone and Rizzo. And what else? Godhead, I mentioned. It's a very cool supernatural thing I got to work on, a graphic novel as a writer called The Resurrectionists, which is being drawn by a guy named Jeremy Love for Abrams Books, an Abrams Books imprint called Megascope. Pretty pumped about that. And a bunch of stuff. It's been pretty productive last few years. Got to work on Captain Canuck, which is a Canadian superhero, which I loved as a child, and there's been a bunch of stuff.
Awesome. And then there's that Luke Cage.
Yes.
yeah, we're excited for all of that stuff. That's awesome.
That one too.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that you're getting into some TV film production. Do you have anything that you want to share with us about that, or is it just sort of now it's started coming together? I've seen you post some pictures and stuff. I don't know if you're just doing filming or test runs. So yeah, how's that going?
Well, filmmaking is finally starting to pay off. Like I said, one of my early inspirations were the movies. It was Star Wars, basically. That was kind of the big linchpin for me. And I've said this 1,000 times. 1,001 can't hurt. I always wanted to get in the movies, but it was easier to pick up a pen and paper than it was to get a camera. And that's not to say that I've ever thought of comics as second best. I love comics as their own, unique, special art form. And I'm hella thrilled and privileged to have gotten to work in them over the years, especially lately. But I also love the movies at the same time. And that movie obsession was not going away. So I went to film school around 2011, 2012, something like that. And cranked out a shit ton of short films, and finally got a chance to direct a feature film in 2018. And I've got another one in development now. And finally getting the chance to do some screenwriting at the Hollywood level. So that's nice. That's like been a lifelong dream. And it's fascinating to kind of compare, because mostly what I've been doing lately has been writing a lot of comics and writing some cinematic stuff. And it's been fascinating to sort of compare and contrast the differences between screenwriting and comic book writing. And I always thought there was a lot more overlap between the two of them, since you're telling stories through pictures and words. But it's only since I've been sort of practicing them, at a higher level the last few years, that I have really started to see the differences between the two mediums. And I always wanted to do like little movies on the page. Now I have zero interest in that. Now I'm much more interested in exploiting comics for what is native to them and to them alone. And so it's fascinating to sort of compare and contrast the two art forms, even though it seems like there's so much overlap between the two of them.
Right. So like I guess for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the DC universe, how they're taking those movies, and they've done it in the past where there was sort of smaller budget. In the 80s you had Superman and Batman, and sort of like growing. Now that Marvel's here, they jumped into the forefront with all their massive, big budgeted, awesome cinematic, movies. How do you translate? Is this exciting for you to see the sort of what they've done? And is that giving you a little bit of inspiration and thought, like, maybe you can grab a few characters across whatever universe? It doesn't have to be Marvel or DC, or I honestly want to see more indie comics maybe come to film and stuff like that. So has that sort of triggered anything for you?
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things that we're working on now is an adaptation of one of my graphic novels, a thing called
Hmm.
Sand and Fury, which we're doing for a company called Anti Gravity Entertainment.
Mhm.
So yeah, as far as my own cinematic output, yeah, I'm much more interested in. I love superhero movies. Um, Not so much of the interest in the cinematic world, is because I sort of prefer that on for myself on the page.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I love those films though. Absolutely. I disagree about Superman being a low budget. That was a huge budget film, as was Batman. But I take your point. They've certainly like
Right.
gone to like the next level and beyond since those
Right.
two films.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, in many ways, I kind of feel like superheroes exist better on the big screen because for me, they're morality plays. They're 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 examinations of myth,
Mhm.
and they're they're using spectacle to examine. I think when they're done at their best, they're using spectacle to examine essential fundamental truths about humanity and human nature. And I think
Mhm.
those things just play out better on a huge screen with sound and movement
Right.
and people around you getting jazzed up by it as well. And what I like better in terms of comics, I just feel like we don't do action and spectacle just as well, even though our budgets are unlimited on the page.
Mhm.
Um, when you combine movement and sound, that kind of blows away spectacle that's just presented on 2D on the page,
Mhm.
in my opinion. So
Right.
I think in some ways our stories, if superhero stories, are maybe better reflected, or maybe better represented by telling smaller stories, more character-based stuff. You know,
Mhm.
that's about people relating, and some of the smaller moments and some of the bigger moments, because we just can't compete on the same level. Now that
Right.
having been said, I'm doing Luke Cage, and I'm not like trying to hold back on the spectacle. All right, like we still got car chases and run and gun stuff and people jumping and kicking, and there's a lot of that, and I'm
Right.
having a ball doing that stuff. But I'm
Mhm.
just trying to balance that with the smaller moments, because I really feel like comics excel at the intimate over the spectacle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Those intimate moments, those, short conversations with, another person and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
But that's just
awesome.
my opinion. Others will disagree.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's always the boys, right? The boys show. They
Oh my
basically
god,
took the they took the
I love that
superheroes
show, man.
and
I love that show. I think that show
it's
is
like what the real superheroes would really do. Like if you
yeah, probably. That is a scary, scary thing. I love that
Yeah,
there's
show.
no
that was something that I was actually going to say when you were talking about how, comics are only 2D and film is, a whole different side of a budget and what you can show. And I think that you see that with a comic like The Boys, because it was basically a comic and graphic novel first. And then, for lucky for Derek, Amazon
Robert.
picked it up and they were like, let's try something with this, and bam, it brings the characters to life. They have emotions, you see that on screen. It's like in 3D depth, there's special effects, and you just get more drawn into it, I think. And I think that Marvel's done a fantastic job of that as well with their characters across the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Especially, I got to be honest, especially with Deadpool, right? Because for a long time, Deadpool was just this character in comics that would pop up and be funny, and he was a satire character. But then
Yeah.
his movies just took off, and now every convention you go to, there's at least 4 or 5 people dressed up as Deadpool that you're gonna walk into. Like there's Pizza Deadpool, there's Deadpool in a full assassin's outfit, there's Deadpool with a rubber ducky with the Hello Kitty backpack, and I ran into a Deadpool with a what do you call that? Inflatable water donut, like the tubes that you
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
go in the pool with, and he had
Yeah.
that around him with a bathing suit on, just walking around the convention. Like I was like, whoa, that's pretty cool. How do you
That
Next
is
think of
level,
that?
man.
when I grew up, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Man. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you totally.
Awesome. Awesome. So
So
Hochi, go ahead.
Oh,
Hello?
I was just gonna ask him because we do this. This is just a simple question we always ask creators.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a favorite superhero, and do you have a favorite supervillain?
I don't have a favorite super villain. I have a favorite superhero though. I like Superman. I know that's not very like very cool to say, or people maybe don't have so much respect for Superman, but I like Superman. I've always liked Superman. I
Mhm.
maybe it's because I was such a massive fan of the movie when I was a kid, and that really like had a big impact on me for a number of years. I still love that movie passionately. There's just something about that character that I just like. He's sort of the proto superhero. I like the way he looks. I like the optimism of that character. I like the fact that there's a scary aspect to him because he's got all this power, yet he chooses to be a good guy. But what if he flips out and just, didn't they do that with Gods? What is it, Gods Among Us, or something
Mhm.
like that, where Lois dies and Superman flips out? That's so scary. I kind of like that aspect of him as well. I don't know. There's just something about that character that I've always responded to. People have said, I would seem like more like a Batman guy of the two, just because my stuff tends to be a little darker, and I've never shied away from violence in my storytelling or anything like that. And I like this sort of more darker aspects of storytelling. And yet, if I was ever given the choice to do Superman or Batman, I would take Superman a heartbeat. I love that character for some reason. So yeah, that one's my favorite. Other than that, it's all. Oh, I also really like Daredevil too. I'm a
There you
big
go.
Daredevil guy as well, mostly because
Awesome.
I'm a Frank Miller guy, and I like how tortured that character is. I kind of have a soft spot for grief porn and like torture porn, like torture of the soul porn,
Yeah.
and you can really kind of wallow in the pain with Daredevil, and I like that aspect of him, and I
Mhm.
also just think he looks totally badass.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like those kind of characters. But other than that, I don't really care. I mean, you can do something cool with almost any character if you have the right take on it.
Right.
And Luke Cage, I lucked out getting my hands on Luke Cage. He's pretty cool too, especially right now. I think
Yeah.
Luke Cage is a great character for this particular moment we're going through.
Yeah. Yeah. We're excited to see Luke Cage, and we'll definitely be sharing and buying and reading. So
I hope so,
that's
guys. I
awesome.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's one thing that we are gonna definitely do in the group, and I hope to Paris is start reviewing some of those Marvel comics there.
Oh yeah, yeah, we definitely will. We'll definitely do that. Yeah, so Ho Chi, it's been good. It's been great. This has been awesome. I think and the, for time's sake, we just want to make sure we're keeping great time. This has been an awesome conversation. Is there anything sort of you want to share to let people know where they can find you online, and Twitters and the
Yeah,
interwebs and all that fun stuff?
absolutely. I've become quite a fan of Instagram over the last year or so. I just have a good time just sharing random stuff, and I really like to engage with people that
Mhm.
way. So yeah, you can always track me down on Instagram. Easy to find there. You can find me on Facebook. I don't spend as much time there as well as I do on Instagram though.
Okay,
And
awesome.
Twitter, no Twitter. Twitter is bad.
Those characters go crazy.
Oh my god, those Karen pics, man. I can't take the Karens, brother. No
Oh yeah,
Karens, no Karens are all horrible.
I've
Awesome,
seen a lot
awesome.
of people leave Twitter lately. A lot of artists leave Twitter lately. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't blame them, man. It just seems so toxic. There's toxicity on those other platforms as well, but I don't find myself being confronted with it so thoroughly as I've seen on other friends' Twitter accounts and what I've come across at Twitter over the years. So I just stay away from
right,
that one.
right.
You know.
Yeah, because on Instagram, at least you do a photo and you talk about your photo, and the focus is your photo. But if you tweet something, oh, that was amazing.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It sucked, right? You're like, what are you
You
talking
know, you're
about?
in the middle of a shitstorm, man. For what?
Right.
It
Like,
ain't
who
worth it,
are
brother.
you again?
Exactly.
That's some ghost made account or something like that. So
Right.
Well,
awesome.
I just want to say that it was awesome getting to talk to you, getting to know you a little bit, and
Thanks,
talking
Carlo.
about your passions. And I can see that you have a lot of passion for what you do. You're very
Absolutely.
into it, and you've had some great mentors that may have torn down some walls and made you try harder and harder until you
Yeah,
achieved your peak at the time. And I think that's great, man. I can't wait to start reading your stuff. I'm gonna go
awesome.
back and read your Martin Luther King Jr. stuff as well. So I'm pretty excited for everything that you got coming out and everything that you've done. I'm gonna go back and look at some of that Vortex stuff too if I can find it.
Yeah. You won't be able to find that stuff, but you can find some of my stuff. It's still out there. Try
Right.
Godhead, and I'd be curious to see what you think about Godhead.
Godhead.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Awesome. All right, Ho
So
Chi.
I
Right
was
back.
just gonna say anything else you want to say before we exit.
No, no, I'm good to go. This was a lot of fun, guys. I really appreciate you giving me a little bit of your time, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, great questions.
Awesome. Awesome. We appreciate it. Thank you. All the best with all the future endeavors.
Thank
We're
you.
looking forward to it. We'll share across all the platforms once they do come out. So yeah, we look forward to seeing more of your work and
Thank you.
hopefully catching some of your feature films and stuff like that and seeing
Hopefully.
your name pop up in credits and stuff. So yeah,
That'd be
awesome.
great. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
All
Okay,
right, thank you
guys.
very much.
Thanks, Carl. Peace, guys.
Anytime. Bye.